9:40 p.m., February 15, 1898. The USS Maine sits at anchor in Havana Harbor. 350 sailors aboard. Lights burning, water calm. Then, a sound like a cannon shot followed. Seconds later, by a second explosion that tears the forward third of the ship apart. In 6 minutes, she's on the harbor floor. By the next morning, the newspapers already have the answer. The Evening Times runs the headline, "Blown up by Spain. Every evidence that the Maine was torpedoed. Nobody has investigated. Nobody has dived the wreck. The water is still warm, and the verdict is already in print."
Here is the thing that should stop everyone cold. The 1898 Naval Court of Inquiry concluded a mine destroyed the Maine, and that verdict is what launched the Spanish-American War. But the court never determined who planted the mine.
Spain denied responsibility from the start, and 100 years of forensic re-examination has pointed the finger somewhere the 1898 court never looked. The ship's own coal bunker.
Wait, so the cause of a war might have been the ship's own boiler room having a bad day.
Curious, and it gets more specific than that. In 1976, 78 years after the explosion, U.S. Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover commissioned a private technical study. His team concluded the explosion was almost certainly internal, a spontaneous coal bunker fire that ignited the forward ammunition magazines. No mine, no Spain, an accident.
Rickover wasn't a fringe figure. He was the father of the U.S. nuclear navy, one of the most credentialed naval engineers in American history. And he looked at the same evidence and reached the opposite conclusion from 1898. Calm. So how did the Maine end up in Havana in the first place? The ship was dispatched in January 1898. Officially a friendly visit, unofficially a show of force to protect American business interests during the Cuban uprising against Spanish colonial rule.
Friendly visit, sure. Nothing says friendship like parking a battleship in someone's harbor.
Captain Charles Sigsbee commanded the Maine, and by his own account, he did not expect any danger. His statement published the morning after the explosion said exactly that. "I did not expect she would be blown up."
Go back to that. Sigsbee's own words were published the morning after the blast. Was that the same front page as the blown up by Spain headline?
The same front page. Sigsbee urged the country to suspend public opinion pending further investigation, and the headline directly above him declared Spain guilty. The Naval Court of Inquiry convened on February 21, 1898, 6 days after the sinking, and wrapped up exactly 1 month later on March 21. Their formal conclusion described the first explosion as a small detonation sounding like a gun report, followed by a far larger secondary blast from 2 or more of the Maine's forward powder magazines.
A 1-month investigation for a verdict that started a 4-month war. That math is a little lopsided.
And specifically, what was the physical basis for calling that first explosion external? Were they measuring blast patterns, or was this mostly witness testimony?
Mostly witness testimony and the 2 explosion sequence. The court reasoned that the pattern, small report first, then catastrophic magazine detonation, implied something outside the hull triggered the chain. That logic is not unreasonable, but it is also not forensic engineering.
So the sequencing of sounds was doing a lot of work in a verdict that launched a war. Noted.
Meanwhile, Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World were running Remember the Maine as a daily drumbeat before, during, and after the court was sitting. Hearst reportedly told his illustrator Frederick Remington, who had gone to Cuba and found nothing dramatic to draw, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war."
That quote should be above the entrance of every journalism school, in neon, as a warning.
Skeptical, is that quote actually verified? Or is it one of those lines that's too good to check?
Historians debate it. Remington denied it. Hearst never confirmed it publicly, and no original telegram has been authenticated. But it circulated in Hearst's own lifetime, and he didn't sue anyone over it. Whether he said it or not, it perfectly describes what both papers were actually doing.
So the most famous quote about yellow journalism might itself be yellow journalism. Outstanding.
Spain ran its own parallel investigation at the same time the U.S. court was sitting. Their conclusion: the explosion was internal. an accident originating inside the ship.
And Spain had every reason to push that finding. If you blew up an American battleship, you absolutely say it was an accident. So how much weight do we give their conclusion?
That's the uncomfortable part. Their technical finding aligned with what Rickover's engineers concluded in 1976 and what the National Geographic study found in 1998. The Spanish had a political motive to reach that conclusion. Yes. But the conclusion itself turned out to be the defensible one. American newspapers dismissed it entirely at the time.
So Spain said, "It was an accident." America said, "You're lying." And then 78 years later, America's own admiral said, "Spain was right, rough."
10 weeks after the explosion, Congress declared war on April 25, 1898. The war lasted 109 days. When it ended, Spain ceded Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
The United States basically walked away from a ship explosion owning the Pacific. That is an extraordinary return on a maritime disaster.
Excited. And all of it, the entire American empire in the Pacific, traces back to a cause of death that 3 separate investigations couldn't agree on. That's the part that should make people genuinely uncomfortable.
Which brings us to the foundational problem with the 1898 court's verdict. The Maine was sitting on the harbor floor. Divers went down and examined what they could reach. But the keel, the single most important structural piece for determining whether a blast came from inside or outside the hull, was completely inaccessible under mud and wreckage.
Walk me through that. Why specifically is the keel the critical piece?
A mine detonating beneath a ship would drive the keel upward and outward. The blast force pushes from below. An internal explosion would push the keel downward. The direction of the keel's deformation is essentially the smoking gun. The 1898 court could not get to it, so they built their external mine conclusion on survivor accounts and the sound sequence alone.
So the most important piece of evidence was buried under mud, and they went ahead and started a war anyway. Cool. Fine. No notes.
Rickover's team didn't just reread the old testimony. They brought in structural engineers and explosives experts to look at the historical photographs and salvage records with modern methodology. Their key finding was about the hull plates. They bent inward.
And inward is the tell. A mine detonating outside the hull pushes plates inward at the blast point but outward at the edges. The signature is different from an internal explosion driving everything outward from the center.
Exactly. The 1898 court didn't have the engineering framework to read hull deformation that way. That methodology simply wasn't applied to naval accident investigation in 1898. Rickover's team wasn't finding new evidence. They were reading the existing evidence with tools the original court lacked.
So 78 years of better physics flipped the verdict. That's not a conspiracy. That's just a really expensive lesson in waiting for the science to catch up.
Okay, walk me through the coal bunker piece specifically, because coal started a war sounds insane until you hear the mechanics.
Com Bunker A-16 was directly adjacent to the Maine's forward ammunition magazine, separated by a shared bulkhead. Coal bunkers on 1890s warships were genuinely dangerous. Spontaneous combustion from coal dust was documented on at least a dozen U.S. Navy vessels in that decade alone. A slow smoldering fire in a 16 could have transferred enough heat through that shared wall to cook off the magazine next door.
So the ship was basically a bomb with a coal furnace attached to it, and nobody thought that was a design problem.
Were other ships reconfigured after this? Like, did the Navy look at all the other vessels with coal bunkers next to magazines?
That's actually a documented consequence. The Navy did subsequently redesign magazine placement on later ships, which itself is a quiet acknowledgement that the fire hazard concern was real. But in 1898, that redesign was still years away.
And the National Geographic study that came out 100 years later, in 1998. What specifically did computer modeling add that Rickover's team couldn't do in 1976?
The 1998 study used three-dimensional computer modeling of the wreck site to simulate the blast propagation. Their conclusion was more specific than Rickover's, not a slow smolder, but a coal dust flash fire. The distinction matters because a flash fire produces a faster, more violent initial pressure wave, which better matches the two explosion sequence the survivors described.
A computer in 1998 figured out what a courtroom full of admirals in 1898 couldn't. I love that.
And National Geographic published these findings in Naval History magazine, not a tabloid. This was pure adjacent scientific work, timed to the centennial of the explosion.
Skeptical, but here is where I want to push back a little. Mine theory supporters have a counter that's not nothing: the absence of mine debris. No wreckage, no chain, no fuse mechanism was ever recovered. Mine advocates say the blast could have consumed the device entirely, so the absence of evidence genuinely doesn't resolve this.
The bomb destroyed all evidence that a bomb existed is doing some real heavy lifting as an argument.
It's not unreasonable, though. A contact mine in 1898 wasn't a sophisticated device, and the harbor floor has never been comprehensively searched, even with modern equipment. We are working with what divers could reach in 1898 and what photographs captured in 1911.
That's the honest answer on the mine question. Absence of evidence in an unsearched harbor is genuinely ambiguous. What the physical evidence does favor is internal origin. What it cannot do is rule out a mine with certainty. Those are two different claims.
So 127 years later, the most honest verdict is probably an accident. But we left the crime scene under 30 feet of mud.
And the death toll distribution reinforces the internal explosion case even if it can't prove it. Of the 354 crew aboard, 266 died. But the officers who berthed in the stern, away from the forward section, survived at a dramatically higher rate than the enlisted men sleeping near the forward magazines. The casualties clustered exactly where an internal forward explosion would concentrate the damage.
That distribution pattern holds regardless of what triggered the explosion. Mine or coal bunker, the forward magazines going off, is what killed those men. So the death toll data doesn't actually distinguish between the two theories. It just confirms where the main blast originated.
Right. It rules out a rear hull strike, but it doesn't settle the mine versus internal question. What it does is make the 1898 court's mine location claim slightly more specific. If a mine caused this, it was positioned under the forward hull, not amidships or aft.
266 men, most of them enlisted, most of them sleeping. Whatever started that fire, they never had a chance.
There is one more examination that tends to get overlooked. In 1911, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers built a cofferdam around the sunken hull, pumped it out, and actually got inside the wreck for the first time. They removed the remaining crew members' remains, examined the structure, then towed the hull out to sea in 1912 and sank it with full honors.
And what did the 1911 examination find?
They concluded, again, that the primary explosion was external, supporting the mine theory, but critics point out the examination happened 13 years into American imperial expansion, built on that very verdict. The engineers weren't operating under independent scientific conditions. They were operating inside a political context, with a strong institutional interest in confirming the original finding.
So the third investigation was run by people whose country had just fought a war over the first investigation's conclusion. That's not exactly a blind study.
Skeptical, it's the structural problem with all three official examinations: the 1898 court, the 1911 Corps of Engineers, the Rickover study. Each one reflects the institutional assumptions of its moment. None of them was truly independent. Alex, does Morgan have a point there?
Morgan has exactly the right point, which is why the National Geographic study matters. It was commissioned outside the military chain, with no institutional stake in either verdict. That's the closest thing to independence the Maine has ever gotten.
And what did the most independent study say? Coal bunker. Great, love that for everyone.
Which brings us to the document that puts the whole media dynamic in one frame. That same Evening Times front page, February 16, 1898, carried Sigsbee's own statement alongside the screaming headline. He wrote that public opinion should be suspended until further report. The paper printed his words and then printed "blown up by Spain" in the same column inches.
So the man who commanded the ship, the only person who was actually there, said wait, and the press said no.
The expert on the scene said, hold on. The guys with ink said, actually war. That dynamic did not die in 1898.
It's the most telling single artifact of the whole episode. Not because it proves Spain didn't do it, it doesn't, but because it shows that the institutional pressure to reach a verdict moved faster than the evidence, and it moved against the explicit public request of the one witness with the most authority.
And that's what makes this a pattern worth naming rather than just a 126-year-old news story. Tell me if you think that's right for the next part, because I want to be precise about what's actually confirmed here. Calm hairs what is not in dispute. February 15, 1898. The Maine explodes and sinks. 2 sequential explosions, a smaller initial report, then a catastrophic secondary blast from the forward magazines, 260. 6 of the 354 crew members die. That much is bedrock.
The least controversial part of this whole story is that the ship blew up and most of the sailors on it died. Everything after that is a fight.
The divergence starts with cause, the 1898 Naval Court, external mine, Rickover's 1976 study, internal accident, the National Geographic computer model in 1998, coal dust flash fire specifically. 3 separate investigations, each using better methodology than the last. 3 different conclusions. The cause is genuinely unresolved. Not conveniently unresolved. Actually unresolved.
And it's worth being specific about what unresolved means here. It doesn't mean equally plausible. The weight of the forensic evidence, hull deformation, bunker proximity, the documented history of coal dust fires on Navy ships leans toward internal, but leans toward is not the same as proved.
So the verdict is probably the ship's fault, but we can't be sure because we left all the evidence in the ocean.
There is one confirmed fact that gets less attention than it deserves. Spain's own parallel investigation in 1898, conducted simultaneously with the U.S. court, independently reached the internal explosion conclusion. The Spanish weren't copying Rickover. They got there themselves, 78 years earlier, from the same event.
And the response from the American press and government was to dismiss it entirely as self-serving. Which, yes, Spain had every motive to say, it wasn't us. But the technical finding was sound. Motivated reasoning can produce correct answers.
The guy with the most to gain from the alibi turned out to be telling the truth, is a very inconvenient plot twist for everyone who already started a war.
What we can say with confidence, no physical evidence of a mine was ever recovered. No Spanish operative was ever identified as responsible. The 1898 court attributed the explosion to an external device but explicitly could not attribute it to Spain. Those are 3 distinct statements that often get collapsed into one, and collapsing them is how the historical myth persists.
And the 2 theories that really need separating, because people conflate them constantly, are Spain did and America staged it. Those are completely different claims with completely different evidence problems.
Calm, right. So let's be precise. The speculation that Spain or Spanish agents deliberately mined the harbor. No mine debris was ever recovered. No Spanish operative was ever named, let alone charged. The 1898 court concluded a mine existed but explicitly stopped short of attributing it to Spain. That attribution happened in newspaper headlines, not in the court's actual findings.
That's a distinction the press completely erased. The court said mine. The journal said Spain. Those are not the same sentence.
We found a murder weapon but don't know who held it. Became Spain, pulled the trigger somewhere between the harbor and the front page. Efficient.
Skeptical and the other speculation that American interests engineered the explosion as a deliberate pretext for war, that one has even less support. Sigsbee was genuinely caught off guard. His own statement proves it. The Hearst and Pulitzer papers had been beating the war drum for months before the Maine ever sailed into Havana Harbor.
Opportunism is not the same as orchestration. The press and the expansionists wanted a war. They had wanted one for months. The Maine gave them a moment to channel that pressure into action. That's a different thing from planning the explosion. The record simply does not support a staged event.
We didn't start the fire. We just made sure everyone knew about it immediately, and blamed Spain as somehow not the exonerating statement they think it is.
But it does mean Hearst and Pulitzer share real moral weight here, not as conspirators, but as accelerants.
So what does the Maine actually teach us? Because I don't think this is just a historical curiosity.
Calm, it's almost a template, a genuine tragedy, a ship, 266 men, a real explosion, gets absorbed into a political narrative so fast that the narrative becomes the event. The press declared a verdict within hours. Congress acted within weeks. The forensic challenge to that verdict came 70. 8 years later, long after the war was won, the empire was built, and the dead were buried.
By the time the science caught up, There was a whole Pacific Empire in the way of the correction.
And the Sigsbee problem keeps nagging at me. The man who commanded the ship, the one person with direct first-hand knowledge, said in print, on the same page as the screaming headline, "Suspend public opinion." The press printed his words and then ignored them in the same issue.
That gap is the pattern. It's not unique to 1898. Every major news-driven military escalation since then has had a version of it. The person closest to the event urging caution while institutional momentum overrules them. The Maine is just where you can see the mechanism in its most naked form. Because the evidence and the verdict are sitting right next to each other on one front page.
Sigsbee wrote, "Wait." History wrote, "War." One of those had better PR.
The psychological piece is the one I find most uncomfortable, though, because this isn't purely a media failure story. Americans in 1898 already wanted the war. The Cuban uprising had generated genuine public sympathy, real outrage at Spanish colonial violence. Expansionist sentiment had been building for years. The Maine didn't manufacture that appetite. It just gave it a righteous trigger.
Curious, that's the honest accounting. The explosion didn't create the war. It gave the war permission. The desire existed independently of the evidence, which means that even if every newspaper had printed Sigsbee's cautionary statement in full, on the front page in large type, the political current might have carried the country to the same place anyway.
So the really dark read is that the Maine wasn't the cause, it was the permission slip. And permission slips don't require accuracy, just timing.
Which puts Hearst and Pulitzer in a specific role, not architects of the war, but permission slip processors. They provided the emotional infrastructure that turned a disaster into a mandate.
If you want to follow more of these cases where the story gets ahead of the evidence, and it apparently happens on a regular enough basis that we have a whole show about it, subscribe and hit the bell. We are here every week.
There is one physical artifact that ties the whole arc together. On February 15, 1915, exactly 17 years after the sinking, the United States dedicated a memorial at Arlington National Cemetery built around the actual mainmast of the U.S. Maine, 260. 6 crew members are buried in a semicircular plot at its base.
So the memorial is literally made of the ship. The wreck became the monument.
Curious. And what does that mast memorialize, exactly? Because by 1915, the 1898 court's verdict was already the official story, but Rickover's study wouldn't come for another 61 years. The men buried there have a cause of death carved in stone that 3 subsequent investigations couldn't confirm.
That's what makes it quietly devastating. The monument enshrines a verdict. The families of those 266 men buried there deserved the truth. And what they got, in marble and mainmast, was the version that served the political moment.
266 graves and the headstone question, what actually killed them, is still technically open. That's a weight I wasn't expecting to feel at the end of this episode.
Calm Hair's where we land. A ship exploded. 266 men died. The most powerful newspapers in the country declared who was responsible before a single diver had touched the wreck, and a war followed within 10 weeks. The actual cause, internal accident or external mine, may now be permanently beyond reach.
The wreck of the Maine is still on the floor of Havana Harbor. It has been there for 127 years. The harbor has never been comprehensively searched with modern equipment. The answer, if there is one, is down there in the silt, and nobody has gone to look.
A war, a Pacific Empire, 266 graves at Arlington, and the crime scene is still sealed. We just sealed it with water instead of police tape.
Next week, we are looking at Operation Ajax, the 1953 CIA and British intelligence operation that removed Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power. A democratically elected leader, an Anglo-Iranian oil company contract, and a coup template that both governments used as a blueprint for the next 70 years.
If you want to see how the Maine's logic, act first, justify later, got exported into a full operational doctrine, that's the episode. Subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you there.